Resolved, we believe that the death penalty should be abolished because it's an unjust act for a multitude of reasons. It is our opinion that if anyone has committed heinous crimes that are previously deserving the death penalty, that they should be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Before the reasons, let me first clarify some definitions. Capital punishment, which can also be used in this debate, is the entire process of trying the accused and then awarding the death sentence to him by a judicial court of law. The death penalty is the actual act of killing the individual, whether through lethal injection, electric chair, fire squad, or any other method. So when someone says the death penalty or capital punishment, it's pretty interchangeable, but just know that in the broad scheme, capital punishment is like the whole entire process. Reasons. There is a risk of executing an innocent person when performing the death penalty. We all value life, and we all know that we should not kill anybody if it's an unjust act, because then that's murder. There has been 144 death row exonerations in the USA since 1973. So there's been people that have been cleared of their crimes. And the reasons they have been cleared is because most of the time it's due to bad technology when their crime was committed. So there's been ballistics back in the 90s and 80s and DNA testing where the police department thought they were right in what they were testing, but in reality their testing was faulty and it just added to the accused. Some of the other common causes of wrongful convictions are eyewitness errors, government misconduct, and snitch testimony or false confessions. Another reason that the death penalty should be abolished is inadequate legal representation. Almost all defendants in capital cases cannot afford their own attorneys. In many cases, the appointed attorneys are overworked, underpaid, or lacking the trial experience required for death penalty cases. There have been instances in which lawyers appointed to a death case were so inexperienced that they were completely unprepared for the sentencing phase of the trial. An examination of 461 capital cases by the Dallas Morning News found that nearly 1 in 4 condemned inmates has been represented at trial or in appeal by court-appointed attorneys who have been disciplined for professional misconduct at some point in their careers. Also, an investigation by the Texas Defender Service found that death row inmates today face a 1 in 3 chance of being executed without having the case properly investigated by a competent attorney and without having any claims of innocence or fairness presented or heard at the trial. Another reason the death penalty should be abolished is that the death penalty can have negative effects on the victims' families. The death penalty process is a traumatizing experience for families, often requiring them to relive the pain and suffering of the tragedy. Life without parole provides certain punishment without endless reopenings of the wounds. The death penalty places the focus on legal consequences, not the human consequences. Attention is directed on the crime and the accused instead of where it belongs, on the family and loved ones of the victim and the community. Life without parole punishes the criminal without putting him or her in the headlines. Race also plays a role in the death penalty. The race of a victim and the race of the defendant in capital cases are major factors in determining who is sentenced to die in this country. In 1990, a report from the General Accounting Office concluded that in 82% of the studies reviewed, race of the victim was found to influence the likelihood of being charged with capital murder and receiving the death penalty. Those who murdered whites were more likely to be sentenced to death than those who murdered blacks. The federal death penalty system, a statistical survey from the Department of Justice from 1988 to 2000. The Justice Department review of the death penalty shows that in the past 5 years, 80% of cases submitted by federal prosecutors for the death penalty review have included racial minorities as defendants. Thank you.
So, to start off with, you seemed really concerned about an innocent man being put to death.
Yes.
Do you believe an innocent man has ever been put to death?
It is not entirely proven.
Are you aware that there are 48 steps or 48 criteria that must be proven to be true beyond reasonable doubt before a person can be put to death?
Yes.
And are you aware that that usually takes around 20 years?
Yes.
So during that time span, would you say it's also likely that if there was any reason to doubt that the defendant's guilt, they would likely be acquitted?
Yes.
Okay. Another thing that you mentioned is that the attorneys were unskilled. Obviously, I'm sure there have been cases where there have been unskilled attorneys, but would you believe in the vast majority of cases the attorneys are very skilled, including the ones that are provided by the state?
I would say not entirely.
Why do you believe that?
Because due to the backlog of like death penalty cases, most lawyers or like very high professional lawyers won't take the case up because it takes 20 years, like you said, they have to go through 48 steps. So most lawyers aren't going to commit 25 years of their life for one case. So when the state appoints an attorney, they're just trying to find someone that'll get the work done. And in some cases, the person that will do the work is not the best qualified for the job.
I'm sure in many states that's the case, but in states like Kentucky as well as like in Florida, I know that there are definitely some high criteria that the lawyer must meet in order to be the death penalty. So would you say that maybe state to state it might be handled better?
It can vary state to state. I would agree with that.
Okay. Another thing that you mentioned, excuse me, you talked about the negative effects for the family.
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe that the family, if they choose to, should deserve to seek closure for their lost family member?
Well, it's proven through like psychology that someone dying, like actually the death penalty doesn't bring the best closure for a family.
Well, do you believe that, would you say an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth?
I mean, in some cases I believe that's true, but with capital punishment, when it takes 25 years, like Kentucky, well, she'll bring it up later, but almost every single person in death row has been on death row for over 20 years. So when there is no closure for the family because the case keeps being re-brought up and keeps getting put back in the news, I believe that just keeps reopening the wounds, where if it's life in prison without parole, they know he's there, and that's it.
All right, that's all.
Okay, so 1,188 people have been executed from 1977 until 2009. It's the execution of murderers, treason, things like that. It's an important tool for preserving law and order. My dad has a work friend that he's worked with for a long time named Doug Elam. His son Derek Elam was shot and killed in 2004 by a guy named Jaquan Neblett. Jaquan Neblett started in Detroit, and he came down to Louisville, and he was 18 years old, and he got in a taxi, and he shoots the taxi driver in the back of the head and takes his money. He goes to prison for about 10 years. They let him out. The same year they let him out, he goes into a music store in Lexington on campus and shoots Derek Elam in the back of the head and kills him. So, I mean, you handle it better when he's 18, and you think he's going to change, and he comes right back out and he kills. You're testing it on innocent people's lives. You could prevent the future by, even considering the death penalty originally with Jaquan, rather than killing other people's lives just because you thought maybe he'd change. According to deathpenaltyinfo.org, the racial breakdown of the death penalty is that actually 56% of people executed are white people. So minorities make up a smaller percentage of people who are killed from the death penalty. The death penalty, if it was enforced more strictly, would obviously make people a little more, they would think twice before they commit some of the crimes they commit. But because it's not enforced as strictly, and it takes a lot of time to, get somebody to have the death penalty, they don't think twice as much. It provides closure and justice for the family. Another story is that when my mom was in 7th grade, her dad was shot and killed. She lived in Texas. The guy that shot and killed her, and she's still bitter about this, and she's all for the death penalty because of this. The guy that shot and killed her father went to prison for about 6 months, and he gets out because of money. And so then this guy that just killed somebody a few months ago is running free because the death penalty is not enforced. Another argument that people who do not support the death penalty would have is that it's cruel. The definition of cruel is enforcing pain and suffering on people. The lethal injection is actually, it sounds weird, but it's actually been called a very peaceful way to die because there's no pain involved and you just go to sleep. So that's not cool. It's the best answer to murder, and for the victims, it's the best way of closure and handling the crime that their loved one was in. Thank you.
Okay, would you admit to both of those murder cases that you just said that under death penalty laws they would be killed? Like if they went to trial for the death penalty?
It would have been more likely if they did.
No, because one murder is usually not resolved for the death penalty. You go to prison for a while. Capital punishment is usually involved for more heinous crimes like the intentional murdering of multiple people or cases like that. I just wanted you to know that. So I would like to know, do you know how inefficient the death penalty system is in the state of Kentucky?
No, I don't know how efficient it is.
Okay, 21 of the 34 death row inmates have been awaiting execution for more than 20 years, and 6 have been there for 3 decades or more. So my thing is, do you think Jaquan, even after that first murder, he should have been killed for the death penalty after just one killing?
Not necessarily, but I think it should have been handled better.
So then, like, when you're arguing, like, how would capital punishment, like, affect Jaquan when it's not even his, like, after his crime that he committed, it's not even, like, supposed to be reviewed for the death penalty?
Well, I think if he knew that it was enforced on a harsher crime, that he wouldn't take the risk of going down the road of being 18 years old and killing somebody. Because if you're 18 years old and you kill somebody, you're probably going to kill somebody else later.
Okay, that's it.
The death penalty is ineffective and should be abolished for various reasons, including the fact that it is actually more expensive than life imprisonment, and studies show that it is not actually a deterrent to crime. So my first point is that the death penalty is more expensive. It has been proven that the process leading to capital punishment is far more expensive than life in prison without parole due to all the expenses from trials through appeals and the execution. Because like Bennett said, the death penalty is the act, but capital punishment is the whole process. And the person that's being tried has a minimum of 3 appeals starting off, and that's expensive in itself. And like we've said, the process often ends up being up to 20, 25 years, and with all the appeals and trials, it ends up being far more expensive than life imprisonment. A study in 2011 found that California has spent more than $4 billion on capital punishment since it was reinstated in 1978, and that death penalty trials are 20 times more expensive than trials seeking a sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. California currently spends $184 million on the death penalty each year and is on track to spend $1 billion in the next 5 years. In addition, according to a study of North Carolina State, a murder case costs us $2.16 million more with a death penalty than with a sentence of life imprisonment. Now, my second point is the death penalty is not as much of a deterrent as people would think. Rather than deterring crime, there is evidence that capital punishment increases the murder rate. Now, I have a quote from a man named George Bernard Shaw that says, "Murder and capital punishment are not opposites that cancel one another, but similars that breed their kind." Scientific studies have consistently failed to demonstrate that executions deter people from committing crime any more than long prison sentences. Moreover, states without the death penalty have much lower murder rates. The South accounts for 80% of U.S. executions and has the highest regional murder rate. While the death penalty is successful in shocking people momentarily, it does not leave a lasting impression in people's minds. I have another quote from an Italian criminologist named Cesare Beccaria. He said, "The death of a criminal is a terrible but momentary spectacle, and therefore a less efficacious method of deterring others than the continued example of a man deprived of his liberty."
Okay, so obviously you think the life sentence, like life imprisonment, is like the other side of like the death penalty, like
Yes.
Okay, and you've seen that the death penalty is more expensive.
Yes.
Do you know why it's more expensive? Because
Because of all the trials and appeals that they have to go through over a 20-year period.
And the reason they go through all those trials is to try and make sure they're not giving the death penalty to an innocent person. Don't you think they should give just as many trials to someone facing life imprisonment to make sure that they're not giving an innocent person life imprisonment?
Possibly.
If they gave somebody facing life imprisonment the same amount of trials as they gave somebody facing the death penalty, wouldn't it cost the same?
I guess.
But actually, wouldn't life imprisonment cost more, because then you've got to take care of the person the rest of his life and keep him alive while the other person just dies?
Yes.
I'm done.
So like Blake, I also have a story for you all. This one's not true, but it's poetically true, so just bear with me. There are a boat full of sailors who are they're lost at sea. Their ship has gone down in a storm. They're stranded in the lifeboat for many days out in the open water. And eventually, one of them can see a coastline in the distance. All the sailors immediately grab their oars and start paddling in that direction. And as they get closer to the beach, they can see a tall wooden structure. First, they think it might be a tree, and then as they get closer, they think it might be a statue. But finally, as they get to the point where they can make out what it is, they realize that it's a gibbet. For those of you who don't know, a gibbet is where a person is hanged. And the captain immediately looks up and says, "Thank God, a civilized society." I agree with the captain. I believe in order to have a civilized society, you must have the death penalty in order to receive retribution for the victims of heinous crimes. I would like to clarify what I mean when I say heinous. These are people who have done more than just killed a person. These are people, many of which have kidnapped, raped, tortured, and then murdered many of their victims. I realize it's a very sensitive subject, and it's really tough for the victim and for the victim's family. For this reason, I believe that the victim deserves retribution, and the criminal should be put to death. My opponents have stated that life imprisonment would do just as well. However, I believe that for such a heinous crime, life imprisonment is not severe enough. They have taken away someone's life, and they thus deserve to have their own life taken away.
You mentioned with your poetic story that you think that a more higher society should have the death penalty.
Yes,
Do you believe that we live in an enlightened and humanistic society?
I would say so.
Wouldn't you say that the values of an enlightened and humanistic society should be guided by compassion, mercy, and respect for human rights?
I would say an enlightened society should be guided by pragmatic views that always strive for the general good.
But don't you think that in our society that we are headed towards human equality and everyone having equal rights to life?
You mean, so people who take life should also have equal rights to life?
Yes.
I would say no.
Well, that leads me into my next question, which you talked about that you don't think that life imprisonment is a good enough punishment for someone who murdered someone, that someone who murdered someone should be murdered.
Yes.
Would you say that the death penalty, that dying for someone who committed that heinous of a crime, would actually be the easy way out?
I would not, because I believe that life is very valuable, In fact, I would say life is probably the most valuable thing that you have, and that's why I believe that's what